And so I suggest we'll get started. I'm here with Chris Benedetti. Chris is managing partner of Sussex Strategy, and I'll let him tell a little bit more about himself and about Sussex Strategy in a few minutes. And we will discuss the somewhat new and old political situation in Ontario. So the Ontario elections are over. The Conservative Party won a tremendous majority, I believe the largest majority probably since the 80s. Other than that, the cabinet ministers are all staying in place, and Chris will talk a little bit about that further down the road. And so what does that mean for the cleantech sector? Can we expect any changes? Can we expect opportunities? And what does the reality for cleantech companies look like? And Chris is going to shed some light on that. Welcome, Chris. Thanks for being with us this morning, and over to you for some further introductions.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And it's great to be here and with Octia, and certainly great to have recently joined the organization as well. So maybe before I get into the presentation, I noticed a few more people are joining now, which is great. But I'm as Mikey was saying, I'm managing partner at Sussex Strategy Group. We are a government relations and strategic communications consultancy that is based in Toronto. We have offices across Canada as well, and a team of people that work with clients in a variety of what are typically heavily government affected or regulated sectors, helping to provide advisory services, facilitation services, and direct advocacy on their interests and issues or in areas such as land use planning and development, healthcare, major project development, and in particular, one of the areas in which we concentrate a lot is in energy and the environment. And so today I'll be walking through with you a bit of information on the political landscape in Ontario coming out of the election, which was a week ago, and obviously the impacts that will have on the clean tech sector, but with a particular focus on the electricity sector in Ontario, because that is one area that we see quite a bit of opportunity and challenges within. My own background, I've been with Sussex since 2004, and prior to that, consulted in Ontario, started actually consulting around electricity issues right around the divestiture of the former Ontario Hydro and market opening. And so I've seen all of the various ups and downs and undulations in our sector over the last 20 some odd years. And prior to that, I worked in our foreign service and at the federal level, both politically as well as in the civil service. And so I will test my acumen in terms of loading this up on the screen, and hopefully this works.
All right, and just as some logistical comments, so please ask any questions you may have in the through the Q&A function, and we will do that at the end, and I can facilitate it. And yeah, and without further ado, back over to you.
Great, thank you. And can everybody see that presentation okay?
I think it's good. I don't see it full screen, Chris.
Oh, okay. Let me see if I can fix that. I know that there's a way to do that.
Display settings on the top, maybe.
Yeah, I'm trying to find that.
If not, Chris, I can share it if that's easier. Maybe we'll have it.
Yeah, maybe if you wouldn't mind, because
Yeah.
unfortunately I'm not seeing that function, so it might be here. I'll stop my sharing and maybe we can load it up on your end.
Sounds good. All right. Okay, it's going to take 1 second. I have it here. Great. There we go. Can you see that okay? And yeah. I'll start full screen mode. All right.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you very much. So we'll just go to the next slide. And as I mentioned, one of the things that I'll focus on in particular is themes that we heard a lot of prior to the election, very much around reliability, affordability, and sustainability, particularly in our electricity system. How are some of those themes going to be addressed in the months and years to come? And obviously, what effect that will have on both agencies, regulators, and the ministry itself, and challenges and opportunities for the clean tech sector. Next slide, please. So to the earlier point, it was, some might argue, a historic election. Historic in the sense that it is the largest majority really since David Peterson's in 1987. But what is, you have to go back even further, I think, back in the 1950s to see a majority government win a second time another majority where they actually increased their seat count as well. Huge victory for Doug Ford. And what I would say is that there might be some out there that really sort of say, well, this is a reflection upon the two leaders of the other parties, the NDP and the Liberals, and to an extent that would be true. But I think we have to give credit where credit is due, in that this was a massive victory for Doug Ford, running an excellent campaign, a flawless campaign, and really with a message that resonated with quite a number of voters. And so what it does bring Ontario now is quite a bit of stability, keeping in mind that the Progressive Conservatives ran this election on a budget that they tabled back in April that they did not pass. That still has to be done. But, really with, lots of business still to do, particularly as we continue to emerge out of the pandemic, and economic recovery, growth, infrastructure, affordability are key issues for certainly Ontarians. This is a bigger caucus than what we had before. So in the 2018 election, the Conservatives won 77 seats in 134 legislature. They did lose some for a variety of different reasons over the course of the past 4 years. They now have 83 Progressive Conservatives that have all run under the Doug Ford banner. And so, the Premier is going to have a lot of choice in terms of who goes into his cabinet. As you can see in the top left side, there's representation of Progressive Conservatives from every part of Ontario, both the north as well as the east and the southwest, and including around the 905 and the 416. And so we do expect that there's going to be a cabinet change, and that should happen next week is what we're anticipating. And then, of course, the next order of business is to recall the legislature, have a speech from the throne where the government will outline its agenda, and then bringing back the budget and passing that. Arguably, that could all happen before Canada Day. It is a bit of a heavy lift, but certainly there's time with the strong majority status that the Conservatives have to do that. The whole question about staff, senior staff in government offices are very important. Chiefs of staff, directors of policy, so on and so forth. That will probably take a little bit more time to sort out through the summer. And then it could very well be that we'll see a deputy minister shuffle before the session comes back in the fall too. There are a couple of ministries right now that don't have permanent deputy ministers. And so we expect that will get addressed. Just before we go on, a quick note about the Liberals and the NDP. So both of their leaders have effectively stepped down. And both of those parties will have to do a bit of introspection now in terms of, where they want to go, who will lead their parties. And certainly there is time in that, there's 4 years before the next election. We will have a federal election before we go back to the polls in Ontario. But obviously, what I think one can now take away from Doug Ford is, if populism had a certain feel to it in the 2018 election. Affordability was such a big issue for the government, particularly around electricity and energy related issues. But what we're now seeing is a populism that is much more big tent issues, a populism that is far more progressive. The budget that was tabled back in April was the biggest spending budget that we've ever had in Ontario's history. And so this is a very different progressive conservative government than what we see a Conservative Party looking at, like at the federal level, or quite frankly, what we've seen in places like Manitoba or Alberta. So, this feels a lot more like a Bill Davis style of progressive conservative, very centrist, progressive. We don't hear people talking about fiscal prudency very much. How that changes going forward will be interesting to watch. Next slide, please. So, these are 5 themes that the Conservatives had in their budget around rebuilding Ontario's economy, working for workers, keeping highways and key infrastructures under the priority banner in terms of new spending and things that need to be advanced. Obviously, trying to keep costs down and some degree of affordability, prudency, and also a plan to stay open so that we don't revert back to what we've been living through for the last 2 years. And I would like, Mikey, if you could just maybe play the clip on the top left-hand side, if the one above that. Yeah, this is from election night, and maybe if we could just play the clip and then I'll come back to it. Oh, the no sound. That's okay.
I can hear the sound. I just need to, let me just throw it back.
To the Ring of Fire.
You know what, Mikey, that's okay. I'll explain to you what's in there. So a couple of things just in terms of looking at the visual. So notice that there's no large group of people behind the premier like what we saw in 2018. There's no there's not really a lot of progressive conservative imagery. It's the get it done tagline that is so well in keeping with the premier's ethos and approach. People probably didn't see, the camera was just focused on one of Doug Ford's daughters, but in the background was Scott Moe, who's the premier of Saskatchewan. And what the premier is effectively saying is that it doesn't, we're going to build the road to the Ring of Fire. We're going to we're going to extract critical minerals for electric vehicle production. We're going to get people moving both in transit as well as in moving around by building new infrastructure like highways. But effectively what the premier is saying is that it doesn't matter if you're a liberal or if you're a conservative or if you're a New Democrat, you have a home in this party. And, is very much portraying a very inclusive, a very progressive, quite frankly, agenda. The clip on the bottom left, I won't ask you to play it, Mikey, but effectively it's from the leaders debate. And Stephen Del Duca, who is the leader of the Liberal Party, is asking the premier, under or making an accusation that under your watch emissions from our electricity system are going to rise by 600%, largely through the cycling of more gas-fired generation. That's the assertion. And in response, what Doug Ford says is, we're at a 94% clean electricity system in Ontario today. We're going to get to 100% under my watch. I'm absolutely committed to doing that. And we're also helping to support a clean energy economy. And his large focus is very much on both EV production and critical mineral and the ecosystem that extends from mining to manufacturing production. And we've seen the announcements around an investment in an EV manufacturing center, let's say, down in the Windsor area. But he'll also draw linkages to electrification of steelmaking, both in Hamilton with Dofasco as well as in Sault Ste. Marie with Algoma Steel. So, what we see now is a conservative government that is very much stimulating parts of the economy, very much investing in workers. They have a lot of support from the trade unions, a very centrist style of government coming out of the election. And when it comes to at least electricity related issues, 2 big things that came up in the campaign were, again, access to electricity and reliability. There was actually one day that the premier went down to Windsor because of a focus that had come up in the media and some accusations around an inability to serve load down in the Windsor area for that new Stellantis LG investment, as well as a big focus on reducing emissions. So again, if 2018 was about, I'm going to get rid of the $6 million man, I'm going to clean up Hydro One, and I'm going to reduce your electricity bill by 12%. This election was, we're going to build infrastructure so that people can get electricity. We want it to be clean. That was the big theme coming out of it. Next slide, please. Oh.
It's an opportunity. So
there we go. So just very quickly, some people to watch, as I say, we are expecting a cabinet shuffle, and these are some of the people that were very important, that are continuing to be very important, as we sort of come out of the election. The positions of the 5 cabinet ministers at the top are their, one might argue, existing former positions, but, certainly Todd Smith, Peter Bethenfolly, Vic Fideli, Greg Rickford. We expect to see all of those people back into cabinet. Jamie Wallace, who's the chief of staff to the premier, as well as David Donovan, we expect to still see in government. And then we have all of these other individuals that continue to be very important for the sector. I think one of the big questions for us is not just who stays in cabinet and which portfolios are assigned to which individuals, but also, do we see a deputy minister shuffle? Do we see, staff changes, and what effect will that have on key agencies and some of the other people in the system? 2 people that I'd just like to point out on this in this chart to really watch for are David Cawley, who's the chair of the Electrification and Energy Transition Panel. I'll speak more about this in a moment, but this it was a fairly new appointment that was made just before the election. And then also, I would argue, Susanna Zagar and Leslie Gallinger, in terms of the heads of the 2 agencies, both the OEB and the ISO, in terms of the changes in the mandates that they'll receive coming out of the election, which we expect to be fairly robust. And I'll speak more to that in a moment. Next slide, please. So we are going through a transformative period in our electricity system, in our energy system. There's a lot of contemplation now about what kind of resources do we need and what kind of outcomes are we trying to prioritize. For the first time in a generation, arguably, we are moving out of a surplus situation back into a deficiency standpoint, where through a combination of aging assets, the need to replace those assets, as well as new demand growth or load growth, we're seeing gaps in our availability to serve customers with reliable electricity. And this will likely be a consideration now that we'll be talking about for the next few years. But the playing field is also changing, in that if for the 20th century, you could really look to a few different tools in the toolkit in terms of how we produce and how we transmit or transport electricity, and then how we consume it, there's a lot more disruption in terms of both technologies, as well as much more complex loads that are coming into the system, and quite frankly, bigger loads than we ever saw before. So historically, if we saw a customer with, let's say, a 20 megawatt load, that was considered to be a really big electrical demand. We're now seeing customers that have hundreds of megawatts worth of electrical demand load. And so the ability of our system, both from a generation, a supply, and a transportation through the wires business, to sustain and to address those kinds of needs is becoming more challenged. So the system is now pivoted to one of really managing costs, which is still something that the system is interested in, but really much more of how do we actually procure the supply that we're going to need to meet customer needs. And they're looking in a whole bunch of different areas. So certainly there's been interest in hydroelectric opportunities, both to sustain existing hydro assets, as well as looking at new hydroelectric opportunities in Northern Ontario. A lot of interest in nuclear, potentially not just SMRs, but potentially new build larger nuclear as well. Lots of interest in storage, both lithium ion or chemical storage, as well as new storage technologies, pump storage. And then an expansion of gas assets we have to acknowledge is on the table because of the role that those assets play in the system, and will likely continue to play. And quite frankly, even in that area of fuel transition and fuel sustainability, there's a lot of interest in things like RNG and hydrogen and CCS, and the government has been and continues to actively consult on a lot of those fronts. There's also a lot of talk in terms of how do customers pay for electricity? And so in that conversation, we see a lot more optionality, a lot more choice that customers will have across the different rate classes. And because we're offering customers more choice, there's also more opportunities for clean tech companies to support customers in getting the kind of resources, not just in terms of power quality and reliability, but also in terms of clean energy that a lot of ESG requirements now have customers looking to do. Next slide, please. But this is happening in an environment where the system is really on the cusp of looking at significant market shortfalls. And in fact, the ISO is having a session this afternoon talking about some of their procurements and how some of those procurements they are evolving to address some of those needs. But if you look at these two charts, so the one on the left is from the 2021 annual planning outlook that the ISO came out with, that shows that under every scenario, both winter, summer adjusted, as well as with or without existing resources in the mix, we have a deficiency. And so over time, that deficiency grows. And over time, that deficiency is not only of a capacity type in nature, meaning the ability to secure power at a defined on-peak time, usually through the summer months in our market, but it also becomes an energy deficiency, particularly as we progress to the latter part of this decade, the early 2030s. And if you look at the top left, or excuse me, right-hand chart, what the orange bars show is what the ISO's planned actions by virtue of megawatt in year that they were targeting in terms of securing assets in the market. And the green is a reflection just a few months later of additional efforts that they need to do to fill the gaps. And so these are all measured in terms of capacity. So this isn't just energy, this is capacity, and in the thousands of megawatts. So as you can see, as early as 2025, we have almost a 5,000 megawatt deficiency to meet our operating reserve requirements. And that goes over 7,000 megawatts by 2026. So a lot of attention right now is on, well, what's going to fill that gap? And what are going to be the right resources to meet those needs? Next slide, please. So what is the ISO doing about this? Some might argue that there's a lot here, that they're kind of using a variety of different tools, and that's absolutely true. So the ISO has been evolving a framework that has really been based on competitive solicitations through near-term commitments, really through the capacity auctions. They're looking at competitive procurements, both for existing resources, which is really the focus of the midterm RFP, as well as looking at new build greenfield development assets in the long-term RFP, looking to see how some of those things could be expedited to meet the needs in 2025, and looking at same technology expansions of existing assets that we have in the system too. But where we actually see most of the commercial activity taking place is actually in the area of bilaterals. So some of you might be aware that the ISO has been moving forward in contracting a 250 megawatt lithium-ion battery solution that is being sponsored by NR in the Six Nations down south of Brantford. And also we have a new 1,000 megawatt transmission line that will interconnect PJM or Pennsylvania to Ontario. The ISO is also looking at three pump storage facilities that are also going through a bilateral process, as well as recontracting thermal assets as well. So there's a lot of bilateral work that's going on out there. We predict that there's probably going to be more bilateral work taking place. One other thing that I'll just note in terms of, you might say, well, Chris, if the needs are getting bigger, why, if you look at the midterm RFP, are they adjusting downwards their target from 750 megawatts to 475 megawatts? That's not because the need has eroded at all. That's largely because the universe of assets has actually gone down. So in the last few months, 4 existing plants in Ontario, in North Bay, Nipigon, Iroquois Falls, and Kingston have essentially been, arguably taken out of the system. I mean, they're still there, but they will now be run for the production of cryptocurrency. And so those assets are not going to be available to Ontario in terms of providing a grid need for the next few years, because those owners have sought out for them a more strategic or economic business in cycling those units to produce cryptocurrency. Next slide, please. So I've talked a lot about the sort of supply side of the equation. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the cost. So one would hope that this gets a little bit better. It's not going to be, I'm afraid, because what we're now seeing on the cost side is that two real fundamental trends, and we can debate the sustainability of them. One is that because we are shifting off Pickering nuclear power, because of the decommissioning of that asset between 2024 and 2025, we will start to cycle more gas in the system because gas will now be more of the marginal price setter in the system. You'll see in the top right hand corner that the forecast of the wholesale price for electricity will start going up and start going up fairly dramatically, in that by the end of the decade, we see HOEP getting upwards to around $50 a megawatt hour. That's pretty high. And so if you're in some businesses like steel making, or if you're in some businesses like forestry and quite frankly, any business where you might be able to participate in the Industrial Conservation Initiative, optimize your performance and not pay a lot, if any, of the global adjustment, you're still going to have to pay an HOEP cost, which is going up fairly significantly. Not only that, but because we are continuing to invest in resources, the prediction of the global adjustment is also that it will go up towards the latter part of the 2020s. It will come down in the near term because Pickering is being taken out of the system, but because we need to invest so much money in upgrading the system, both from a transmission standpoint as well as from a supply standpoint, the global adjustment is also forecasted to go up. In fact, this is probably the first time that we see the traditional correlation that if HOEP went up, GA should come down, and vice versa. If GA goes up, then HOEP should come down. That will no longer be the case as we progress towards the end of the decade. The province is also continuing to cross-subsidize a fairly large component of the electricity system cost. So the cost of providing electricity in Ontario today is around $24 billion per year. Around $7 billion of that is being paid for by the Treasury of Ontario. And so if we think about, what does that look like over a long period of time, the chart at the bottom right was drawn from the 2021 budget, provincial budget. That darker blue, that's amounts that will be paid for by the federal treasury, just as related to renewable power and biomass for the next 20 years. And that's in addition to the $3 to $4 billion that the province is already picking up through the Ontario Electricity Relief Program. So a huge amount of debt is being incurred, a huge amount of cost is on the horizon, and reliability is no longer necessarily can be assured. So we're entering into a very interesting time in the Ontario electricity system. Next slide, please. So what's the government doing about it, and what effect is that having on the ISO and the OEB? So, we do expect that these themes are going to be pretty important for the government, and we know that the government is very attuned to them. We saw a lot of activity over the last several months before the election, mandates to the ISO, and we think that that is going to continue. Two things in particular that I just draw attention to. One is the new Electrification and Energy Transition panel that was announced prior to the election. David Cawley, who's formerly of Burlington Hydro, most recently headed up the Electrical Safety Authority. He will be leading that panel. We understand that the government is looking for two other panelists to round out that panel that we expect will be announced, in the weeks we would imagine ahead. But their job is really going to be looking at not only how do we deal with the increase of demand, how do we deal with energy transition, how do we deal with a desire to move to more environmental attributes and sustainability caused either by customer expectations, by government policy, or by standards and mandates at the federal level. And then who should be making the decisions when it comes to policy planning and procurement in our system. And so in that sense, it's sort of a follow-on to the LTEP consultation that the government did earlier in 2021. The other big thing that's going on is the Pathways to Decarbonization study. So this is a mandate that Minister Smith gave to the ISO back late last year to start looking at what would it take to decarbonize Ontario's electricity system? And we expect that the ISO is going to come out with that report later on this year. There's a lot of other things that are going on in the system, and I've mentioned some of them here. And if we just go to the next slide, it's certainly going to be a busy few weeks and months ahead. These are all fairly significant developments in our system that we are tracking and that will be really consequential in terms of some of the outcomes from a policy, from an asset management, and from a procurement standpoint. So again, we're watching these very, very closely. We expect that once government really gets positions itself, we get a cabinet appointed following the election, this could in fact be added on because of the severity of the needs and challenges that are before us. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, I also wanted to talk about the federal landscape, because historically our energy system in Ontario, or quite frankly any province in Canada, has not really had all that much to do with the federal government. One has to go back to the 2000s around WIPI grants for renewable energy to really see a policy that had a pretty big impact on the electricity system. Certainly here in Ontario and other provinces is a little bit different because of in the last number of years, policies that affect coal-fired generation. We haven't had coal-fired generation in Ontario since 2014. So the story is a little bit different in Alberta and Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick. But in terms of the Ontario system, we haven't seen a lot of impact for the federal government, but that is changing. And it's changing because of two things. One, the federal government is coming out with more sticks that will affect what the makeup of our electricity systems look like, particularly as it pertains to GHG emissions. So we've already seen certain sticks in terms of carbon pricing, a levy on carbon going up to $170 a metric ton by 2030. And most recently, we've seen the government start consulting on the development of a clean electricity standard to migrate to a net zero electricity system grid in Canada by 2035. So there's a lot of interest in terms of what measures the federal government is placing on provinces that will have a pretty significant makeup on their electricity systems, in Ontario included, because it's not just about coal, but arguably it's about gas as well. And also the federal government has talked about their interest, not just on the front of the meter, what the electricity system looks like, but potentially going into what does it look like on the customer side of the meter if there is power production happening for whatever industrial process that is being supported. So we certainly see sticks, but we also see a lot of carrots too. And so in the last few budgets, there's been, quite frankly, billions of dollars being allocated to support clean energy. Just in the last few days, we've seen some offset developments coming out of the OBPS system federally in some sectors. That will continue to evolve, but particularly to electricity, here are some of the programs that have received funding. Some of these are exhausted now. We're waiting for them to be refunded, but some of them do have funding still available and have been topped up. And the big one that we've seen doing quite a bit of work is the Canada Infrastructure Bank, but also the Clean Fuels Fund, the SREPS program, SIF and whatnot. And so we've been involved personally in a lot of different programs that have gone through these channels, and we do see that they're having a pretty big impact on asset selection and opportunities in the Ontario market. If we could just go to the next slide. Here are some of the projects in which we see that impact on provincial asset choices. So, the big one, and one that we've had the privilege to work on, is Wataynikaneyap Power. That's an almost $2 billion transmission project in northwestern Ontario, owned by 24 First Nations and Fortis, to help migrate off of diesel generation in 17 remote communities. They received a significant amount of money through a federal provincial contribution agreement. But more recently, we've seen the Oneida Battery Park with Enerstor and Six Nations, the Lake Erie Connector. These are two projects that I mentioned. The Oneida facility received $220 million both through CIB as well as SREPs. Lake Erie Connector has secured up to $655 million through the CIB. We know that SMRs are now included under the scope of what the CIB can fund. Pump storage, could be next. And then, of course, where and what other opportunities do we see federal financing and financial support come through to really help enable projects? And to be clear, when these federal dollars show up, what it really looks like is bringing in federal economic support, financial support, so that ratepayers of Ontario do not have to fully securitize assets. So for a provincial government in Ontario that wants to enhance reliability, wants to keep things affordable, wants to move forward in a sustainable way, and for a federal government that's very interested in building new clean technologies, helping to crowd in investors, and also helping to meaningfully reduce GHG emissions. The Venn diagram in Ontario is quite big, and we're seeing a lot of movement, not just, quite frankly, in clean power, but also on industrial process and retrofits. Algoma Steel is another that we've been involved with, $420 million from the federal government. The expansion of N-Wave's system in the west part of the GTA, $620 million. So we're seeing a lot of those types of opportunities, and they do have a pretty big impact in making those undertakings commercial and monetizing the GHG reductions that those projects will help to achieve. So the big question is what's next, and certainly if we look to Ontario, as we see all of these needs, what opportunities exist out there for proponents and technologies to seize upon the opportunity of federal government financing to help bring some of those opportunities to fruition. So next slide, please. Oh, I think there's just one more. Yeah, so just very quickly, and then we'll move into a discussion. If we look at opportunities for the clean tech sector, particularly as it pertains to our electricity system, we see that there's a big gap in the next few years, certainly in the very near term, but also if we start looking to the future and saying, well, how do we maintain the reliability that the system will need to meet growing customer needs over time, but also how do we do that to enable energy transition, cleaner forms of power? That's going to be something to really watch while we continue to optimize existing assets in the system. And so, I think that it's not really, quite frankly, a question of choices so much within our electricity system, but it's much more a question about what does the diversity of our electricity system, what can it do to help to decarbonize other sectors of the economy? And I'll just give you a great example there in Algoma Steel. So Algoma Steel is helping to reduce carbon emissions to the quantum of 3 million tons per year. So that's the equivalent of taking 1 million cars off the road. That's like taking every single car in Toronto off the road. And they're going to do that through the function of no longer using coal to produce electricity, but rather using electricity to produce steel. And so in order to do that, it requires a lot more power than what the facility is taking today. It requires a lot more infrastructure to provide reliable power to the site, but they also need to cycle an incredible amount of generation at the site to support that activity. And that is going to be gas. And so how do we look at using technologies that we have today and using infrastructure that we have today to achieve decarbonization outcomes? The lead time for infrastructure is getting longer. It's not getting shorter. We're involved in a lot of different projects right now that in order to get cable, in order to get skilled trades, in order to get investors to be interested in projects, it's harder. Interest rates are more volatile. Foreign exchange risk on lithium ion carbonate prices are going through the roof. And so it's getting harder to develop projects, and it often takes longer than it did before, and it's getting more expensive. Also, if we now layer into that the expectation of social license, that takes time too. And so we do appreciate that there's a desire for lower costs, but threading the needle on how you marry affordability with reliability, with meeting customer expectations and doing it in a sustainable way is going to be very challenging. But we also see this as a great opportunity for innovators in clean tech to come along and think about, how do we do that? How can we be part of the solution? And how do we work not only with customers, but with utilities, with the system operator, and with government to try and achieve some of those outcomes? So perhaps I'll stop there, and certainly happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris. So I have tons of questions, and I see there is a question from Brian as well. So maybe I'll start with that, and then I can kind of come up with mine unless there's more questions that are popping in. So Brian asked, this Ontario government uses different expert script when describing clean tech, climate tech, jobs, automotive, etc. What sort of terminology or expert script should companies be using when speaking to this government? Some of our companies may need a Rosetta Stone to translate from their clean tech language into the language on the Ontario PC uses, even though the results can be the same.
It's a very, very good point. And I think that, it's an interesting way of putting it too, in terms of, what is the script or what is the language that they are motivated by? It's changed, quite frankly, over the last few years. I remember, working with the Ford team in the very early days in 2018, and arguably, if they thought about, these types of things, supporting investors and supporting customers, supporting businesses to attract to Ontario, let's say that they weren't necessarily as attuned to ESG commitments that I think they are today. Is it the government that is really, driven that change, or is it more customers that have driven that change? And I would argue that it's the latter. So, a lot of the new investors and a lot of the big manufacturers coming to Ontario, and a lot of the big heavy investments, the two that I heard Doug Ford talk about extensively during the election campaign were Dofasco and Algoma. Well, these are two big projects that are achieving huge emissions reductions, but need to do that to not only make their products more valuable for their own customers, but also because their investors want to see them reduce their emissions and meet environmental targets. And so I think the government sees that reducing emissions is part of open for business. I think that reducing emissions is something that the population wants. And so, the real question is, how do you do that in a way that is going to be economically viable? And how do we do that ideally in a way that is optimizing use of infrastructure that we have today? So, it's not to suggest that the government has no longer believes in affordability. They very much do. I think what they're looking for is, if I can sort of expand or use a different analogy from the Rosetta Stone and think about the decoder key at the bottom of the cereal box, I think what their decoder key would look like is something that connects upon key themes of affordability, reliability, and getting it done, quite frankly, quickly in an environmentally sensitive way. And we're seeing that play out in real time if we look now at opportunities around Stellantis and LG down in Windsor and whatnot. How do you bring everything together? The one other thing is, somebody who makes has made their career out of interpreting things and talking to government and working on solutions. I think a lot of people will sometimes assume that if you give government all the data points, their job is to take all of that, absorb it, throw it into a pot, and figure it all out. Government doesn't necessarily have all the tools to do that well. And so there is a SWAT team that exists within the Ministry of Economic Development, Job Creation and Trade that brings people in from environment, conservation and parks, from energy, from infrastructure, municipal affairs and housing. But they aren't experts on everything. And quite frankly, they need a lot of help from outside third parties, as well as from suppliers and proponents and whatnot, to figure out the various pieces of the puzzle, and then to also try and figure out, well, how do we put the puzzle together to find a solution?
Right. Chris, on that point, so what would your advice be? So when is a good moment to go back to the government post-election and talk about clean tech and present the Ontario clean tech solutions that are available here, and that might help with the electricity dilemma the province is in?
No time like the present. I mean, I think that, in very practical terms, I think one is well advised to see, well, who's going to be in cabinet, what are those mandates going to look like? I think that, that we are at least getting the impression that we'll find out who's in cabinet in the days ahead, not necessarily in the weeks or months ahead. And so we will have clarity in terms of who some of those key arbiters are. We suspect, very shortly. And so as soon as those individuals are identified, I think that there is an opportunity there to engage with them, to sit down with them, to be constructive and collaborative, and as I've been saying, help them be the best possible government that they can be. I think that a lot of the themes that they've talked about in the campaign and the budget are very much aligned with the clean tech sector. And therefore, I think, there is a certain degree of duty that exists in terms of helping them, as I say, identify the pieces of the puzzle and helping to put it all together.
Yeah. Well, we definitely feel that there has been a shift over the last few years, and that clean tech has become, or has evolved from a dirty word to a good word that's also associated with economic benefits and jobs. And we like to take a little bit of credit for that as well. But on to the next question, and we're almost out of time, but there are two good questions here I'd like to ask Chris, if that's okay. So Peter MacArthur asks, Chris, this is great. You mentioned energy storage as a key opportunity, but didn't mention renewable energy sources like solar, wind, geothermal, or even heat pumps. I know the Ford government had a bad taste regarding wind, but it's this turning around with the reality that we need 5,000 megawatts in just 3 years. Nuclear will take 10. I'd appreciate your thoughts. And I think, yes, that is a very, very relevant question here. And maybe I could tag on to that. So no matter what, they have to spend if they build new generation capacity, whatever that looks like. And do you think the government is willing to do a trade-off if that creates as many jobs as possible?
I think the government, and we've seen this as part of their enthusiasm around nuclear. I think part of that enthusiasm comes from an ecosystem that is not just, sees upon the technology to produce a product, but also looking at how that affects the ecosystem of companies that exist here in Ontario, from BWXT to, whatever the suppliers are, the myriad of suppliers in various parts of the supply chain that are already very busy on major component refurb and refurbishment at Darlington as well as at Bruce, but really looking to see how that ecosystem can be, supported through the development of SMR technology or nuclear technology, new build nuclear. And, one of the things that Minister Smith talked about before the election was, quite frankly, the opportunity to market Ontario-made IP and products in places like Poland and Estonia. And so there is a very interesting sort of connection there in terms of Europe, Eastern Europe, and even potentially in the rebuilding of Ukraine. The other thing, though, that I would say that is very germane to the question that Peter asked is, really it's an all of the above strategy. I think that the needs are so great. And one of the things that we are, looking at as an opportunity is that if you look at this decarbonization pathways study that the ISO is working on, that's really to establish a roadmap. So if we want to get to a decarbonized system, what are the asset choices that we need to make? What assets do we have to have in the market, and when do we have to have them in the market? And so arguably there's a product that will come before us in the next few months that one can establish a work back schedule on and say, okay, well, if we want our system to look like this in 2035 or in 2040 or whatever the year might be, well, what decisions do we need to make to invest in what technologies or what opportunities, and what is that going to look like? And I think then the David Colley panel is very much, well, how do we then put the decisions in place, or what are the right milestones that we need to be working towards, and that we actually have an inducement into those types of assets. quite frankly, if you go back to that sort of slide where I had the number of various procurements, there is opportunity for wind and solar through recontracting, same technology expansions. I know that there's, just as there's an interest in terms of hydroelectric opportunities in the north, there's also a good opportunity for wind in the north. But, I think that where we'll likely see the government going to is to say, look, we're technology agnostic. We want the technology to look and feel a certain way to meet customers' expectations, largely around ESG. But we also want high degrees of reliability. We want partnerships. We like the idea of partnerships with local communities, with Indigenous partners. We expect that there's going to be a high degree of social license. But I think that can apply to opportunities across the spectrum, be it in terms of renewable technologies, or be it in terms of things like, quite frankly, heat pumps and new technologies like that. I know that there are conversations going on, including with geothermal, and actually these are some of the areas that are both, where the province is interested in, the federal government is quite interested in, particularly on heat pumps. I mean, we're quite interested of where the future of CDM and DSM goes to enable those kinds of things, both on the residential side in terms of fuel arbitrage and opportunities. So really, I think the easy answer to the question is all of the above, and probably sooner than later.
Yeah, so that's actually quite good news for the clean tech sector. That's good. And maybe a good segue to the next question. Any further signals around virtual net metering on solar, or any positive solar signals to assist additional pursuits of multinationals seeking to relocate?
Yeah, so I think, Mike, it's a great question, and I take it what you kind of are thinking about there too is the opportunities around synthetic transaction, corporate PPAs, and one of the challenges around that, quite frankly, in the Ontario market is the application of the global adjustment. And so, virtual net metering, it's, well, I guess there are two different things. So maybe I'll talk very quickly to both. So virtual PPAs are allowed in the market. It's just the problem with the application of the global adjustment. As we move to more of a scarcity of supply situation in Ontario, will be interesting to see, if that evolves a little bit and the government gets a little bit more comfortable with saying, okay, well, if the system can't supply you with the power that you're looking for, we'll allow you to go out and invest in it directly, even if it's not adjacent to your load or behind the meter, so that you can figure out a way in which you can do that. Now, that might not completely satiate the customer's needs. You might still need a wire and supplied to your site to actually meet your load requirements. But we do think that it's something that's going to continue to be talked about. And the government's interest in the clean energy credit voluntary market is somewhat associated with that. In terms of virtual net metering, so as many of you know, we probably, we do have opportunities for community net metering in Ontario. They're relatively small scale. We had the opportunity to work on the West 5 development. And, I think that that's also something, in talking to the minister and in talking to people, that there is likely going to be increased interest in, particularly as we look at how do we serve communities and customers where the system is challenged in doing so. So look, I think virtual net metering is something that, as we've seen, incrementally, government got more comfortable before the election with third-party ownership for residential net metering. I think that we've seen the community net metering. Will that continue to evolve? I believe it will.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chris. We're already over time. Thank you so much. Tons of valuable insights, tons of action items as well for Octia. But I think the conclusion is quite positive. There are many opportunities for the clean tech sector going forward in Ontario, and I think the government is open to it. So that's great. The glass is half full, definitely. Thank you so much again, Chris. And yeah, for anyone who missed that or was late, came late, we will publish the video on YouTube and on our website. And so you will get the full presentation. All right. And with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thanks again, Chris. Great insights. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks.